morning. I have the honor and pleasure to welcome you here in the Arab Institute in Doha to attend this forum, which is under the title From Bullets to Ballots, Transformation from Armed to Unarmed Political Activism. I would like to warmly welcome all the guests, especially the participants who have come the other part of the world, and I hope they will continue to this struggle. I am honored also to present to you the first speaker and welcoming remarks that will be presented by Dr. Azmi Bishara, the Arab the intellectual person and the Director General of the Arab Center for Research, and he is with us today, so he will deliver his opening remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Once again, I welcome you all in this important conference, which is about a very important topic that does not need any introduction to highlight its importance, because it is very important in all countries, and it will affect all the policymakers in medium. And it is natural that all the researchers should think of this topic. Given this fact, it requires a complicated approach in sociology, politician, and also this comes from a very rich experience that can be valued. We have some guests who will be speaking about that, such as from America and Africa and Latin America. And in fact, the Arab countries were not outside this phenomena, and they have witnessed examples and experiences that will be dealt with in some of the papers. This is a very important Arab issue that, especially in our contemporary history, and this topic will be continuously discussed in our center and in our research papers, and thus we hope that we welcome Mr. Omar Ashour to be here to contribute to that, because the main work of this center is to study such phenomena and to take the historical lessons from them in order to put them into a sort of framework that interprets why it happened. That's why I will not I will not speak too much about the importance of the topic of this conference. But what I will try to do is to give some observations about the approach of research in this topic. I have 4 remarks or observations. The first one, the worst thing that happened to this topic as a subject for study and research is it was since the beginning of the century it was approached with what is called within the framework of combating terrorism and with other practical and sociological. Of course, this has put it under political agendas from the different countries of the region that went into a game of exchanging of interests or treaties about what is so-called combating terrorism. The tyrannic regimes, as most of the case of the Arab regimes, use this to say that, in fact, terrorism is an existential threat in order to justify their terrorism and to put all opposition members in the banner of terrorism or those who support terrorism. The problem is that the political system define terrorism by the identity of the actor, not about the action. That's for such a state, it's not important how to distinguish terrorism from other kinds of terrorism, but just saying that it is against innocent civilians for political reasons. But the important they focus on is that the actor is not an official party or official identity, regardless of the identity of the victim, whether civilian, soldier, or security personnel. This is Consequently, all armed organizations operating outside the law, including the law of an illegal occupation or dictatorship which forbids any kind of political activity, are condemned as terrorist organization. It also entails, or even in dictatorships that does not give and allow any political action, and also they also justify any political terror violence made committed by the state. They consider justified, and they put the accountability on political balances. That's whether it's a crime or not. That depends on geopolitical situation. It all depends on the definition they give to terrorism. Hence, the political armed activity includes all the organizations that work in this way, but excludes the states because they are not considered to be as an armed entity, and all the armed organizations, in fact, according to this kind of definition, are considered to be terrorist organization. And in this way, this is not only not apply on the countries or states that use weapons to solve their political problems, even if their security apparatus and armed forces work as if they are armed militia that do not follow the rule of law. All they focus on is only maintaining the regime regardless of the means to use that. We saw in Iraq and Sudan previously how many countries use the militias and then annex these militias to their armies, and found also some armies that transformed to be militias, as was the case with Sadat and Gaddafi regimes. In such a way, their armies worked more than militias than a regular army, and in fact, in such a way that the political actor obtains international recognition according to Putinian trends and criteria, by which the politics is only monopoly of the state, and any other party or any entity has not have the right to practice politics. Even if a regime targets a civilian journalist by killing him for political purposes after luring him to the consulate, this is not considered as a terrorist act. And I never heard any politician using terrorism as a term to describe what happened with this case, or to consider as part of the terrorism of the states. And this by itself is a scandal. The armed violence is used instead. Violence is but it does not include the violence of the state and the terrorism of the state. We know that. In fact, they are armed entities, even if they are part of a very big conflict with many of the people. I had to give this observation before getting into the topic, that you will see in your discussions that it cannot be understood without understanding the concept of state and the nature of the political regime that rules the state, and one cannot neglect the structure of the state and the regime when we discuss armed groups and the change they make on their policies and ways of acting, especially after the collapse of the the Soviet Union. Second observation, an approach to the topic under the general heading transformations from armed to unarmed political action should not blur the lines between types of armed action and types of peaceful political action. The social sciences, in an attempt to avoid value judgments, usually slide into a pattern of non-discrimination between one weapon or another and one peace or another. There are armed struggles which should never have begun in the first place because they were not launched for liberation or for justice. But justice, I mean balanced combination. real concept of justice, which is a balanced combination of freedom and equality, in the sense of the equality of human value, not homogeneity or uniformity. There are armed movements that have declared their objective to be imposing a particular lifestyle or ideology on the public, or engineering their own vision of society by the religions or secular. There are armed movements that have formed to free their nation from colonialism, or because authoritarianism closed the doors to any kind of political action, peaceful political action. This does not negate the likelihood that those carrying arms, in the case of liberation, could, in the latter case, embrace an ideology or commit acts that corrupt their just cause. Those who pursue, we must not mix between those who have the good guys or the bad guys. Those who pursue justice are not necessarily the good guys, and those who fight for a colonial state or an authoritarian regime are not, in the sense, the bad guys. An armed struggle is not a conflict between the good guys and the bad guys in a Hollywoodian film. And the result, adopting such formula leads to double standards in dealing with committed crimes that lead to tolerating these crimes and atrocities committed by the good guys. However, there are definitely just causes in the world. It's not only bad guys and good guys. There are just causes in the world, of course. These are presented by people who may slip into ideas that do not reflect the justice of their cause, and who may also commit shameful acts that ultimately harm it. While the ideal that a just cause is presented by just people is an example that should be aspired to, but this is not always the reality. Third observation. Naturally, research on topic of transition to peace, as is all branches of comparative political science that study transitions, is a teleological. That is, its aim is to accomplish peace. It has a purpose, which is peace. No matter how much those who work on the topic deny their biases, their work generally seeks with the tools of social sciences to justify and facilitate transition to system. Similar research in transition to unarmed political action looks forward to this transition and searches. And also, those who study this transition to unarmed political action looks forward to this transition and research and searches for ways to strengthen it with the tools of comparative political science and security studies. This is usually a noble aim, and it doesn't take away from the scientific activity objectivity, and objectivity does not necessarily mean neutrality. Social sciences does not, in my opinion, does not require neutrality, but rather objectivity as far as possible. In this sense, social scientists look for reasons behind the transition, military defeat, or a war-weary societal movement, or an impasse leading to the acceptance of the political reality, the promise of amnesty, at least the promise of amnesty sometimes, or a military victory that brought a certain organization to power, or a political reform that was reflected by flexibility from the other side. And this will put the armed movements to assimilate within a system that has become more pluralistic. Researchers often address the social, political, and intellectual context that made such path possible under a particular balance of military power. However, research into the results of each path and the durability and stability of each of the case is not less important. And the pertinent question is, if peace does not exist on the basis of justice, even relative, and finding solutions to the major societal cleavages and the institutional expressions of these wars, and healing the wounds embezzled into memory. Can this peace be sustained? Isn't it likely that would lead to worse violence? We know what a victory of an armed national liberation organization transformational to state and army mean. We also have examples of many militias ending civil, ethnic, or sectarian wars by consensual regime in one state or separation into different states. Let us try to understand what does the transformation from armed political action to unarmed political action, what does it mean under the tyranny of an authoritarian regime? There are, of course, cases of drawing the consequences of military defeat or realizing that the military struggle reaches a dead end and factions and will willingly to return to the civil life and to set. Mostly, this would be the introduction for a sort of democratization in which the real weight of the armed factions is tested in elections. Between these extremes, there are other options like, but between these two possibilities, there are examples of changing the tyrannic regime into a competitive authoritarianism and feckless pluralism. But between the two cases, there are possibilities of changing it into a competitive regime, but only in form. There are examples on this fourth example, some monarchies, Arab monarchies that have there are Arab monarchies that have become more democratic than the republics in containing their enemies and even give them ministerial posts. The fourth observation is concerned with the opposite of this topic, i.e. transformation from unarmed into armed political action, which is considered properly in the same topic. To this really, if I exclude the subject of Palestinian armed struggle from this debate, and I exclude national liberation movements from armed political, what so-called political armed organizations, as the latter carry out violent, illegal political action within sovereign states, while national liberation movements enjoy legitimacy to carry weapons similarly to the legitimacy of states under the condition that this should be understood as a responsibility and not a privilege. Then the Arab experience is, if we exclude the Palestinian liberation movement, then the Arab experience in recent years show that tyranny that leaves no room for political reform and peaceful transformation, if combined with a policy of social marginalization and physical and psychological humiliation, I've much focus on humiliation, humiliation of large segments of the population. This would create an environment conducive to armed action. This does not mean that this environment directly produces armed political action. This action would require human actors whose will, intellectual and social background and culture cannot be omitted from the research. But there is a difference between working in an appropriate and an inappropriate environment. It seems that Arab conditions impose an in reverse question that is placed here, and this is the conditions of transition from unarmed to armed action. It is undoubtable that people in the East or West are generally inclined to be concerned with the running of their daily lives, which obviously means an inclination towards stability, even under despotism and the fear of chaos. They prefer perform transition and peaceful change if possible. But the regime's refusal to reform and rejection of reform and the brutal oppression of peaceful movement may lead to the disillusionment of some of the youth of the population who had pinned their hopes on peaceful revolutions and the civil movement. This may lead some of this to turn to transition to armed action, albeit not everyone whose hopes have been crushed and whose dreams have become a nightmare turned to arms. Picking up arms in the time of counter-revolution increases the ferocity of tyranny and the public's desire for stability, even to the point of acceptance of the existing regime. And the regime and its media and intellectuals help unpoliticize the segments of the population, not only to link revolution and change with armed action, but also to blame the victim. So that is to place responsibility for the regime's crimes on the victims, because because if the victims accept the status quo, the people would not have to surrender themselves to it again. And we saw this in Egypt, where the regime transformed revolution and the struggle for democracy into a matter of maintaining security and stability and combating terrorism, which from another perspective turned the democratic struggle into a struggle for defending human rights. In the countries where revolutions have taken place, but where the army remained loyal to the regime and obeyed orders to fire relentlessly on demonstrators, some social and political forces, some of them, have turned to arms. Armed action in cases of spontaneous civilian revolutions, suppressed by force of arms, become infinitely fragmented, since it has no history of organization in the past. Nor have the spontaneous insurgents gained experience in long-term organized struggle against the regime. Nor indeed do they have a central command to integrate the new insurgents thrown into by the suppressed revolution. Our experience is quite different from that of Latin America. We do not have central forces that to lead the struggle and those who are disappointed. That's why, right from the beginning, the armed struggle in the Arab revolutions, from the beginning, it was segmented. And thus, we found that many formed armed groups emerged spontaneously, some of them presenting different kinds of political moves, some of them Salafists, and some of them have nothing to do with the revolution. Others are linked to some countries that support the revolution and armed activists for their own purposes, and others that only are groups of warlords who have benefited from the control of areas and their resources under the name of liberated zones. There is no doubt that the two exemplary cases here are Libya and Syria. What distinguishes these cases is the lack of central leadership for armed action and the lack of centralized political leadership to whom the military leadership submits. This type of armed action is not based on a unified strategy and does not present a political program, but simply the overthrow of the regime. That's all they wanted. A just demand, not doubt, but one which cannot achieve military victory because the lack of a unified combat strategy and even unified interim military objectives. These groups are also unable to negotiate peaceful solution. Indeed, some elements may be used in negotiation to neutralize them while fighting others to eliminate them. International support for the organization deepens fragmentation in this case. The powers supporting the revolution the powers supporting the revolution become confused about what they should do, particularly in a zero-sum game, in the sense that the defeat of these forces leads to a complete victory for the brutal authoritarianism, the return of which is worse than ever before, because in addition to its previous tyranny, it is now vengeful. But imagine that these armed forces might achieve a victory. Even that victory could not draw a political map for them. And in fact, the Libyan example is the best. It's not a very encouraging example. In the case of the regime collapse, as happened in Libya, where foreign interference ultimately outweighed the fragmentation of opposition forces and the reality of Gaddafi's private armies, which are really militias, and their willingness to commit the most heinous of crimes, armed militias became a real obstacle to building a real state institutions. The existence of a unified state with active institutions is the primary condition, almost the only condition, for democratic transition, alongside the awareness and readiness of political elites to accept democratic procedures as an acceptable compromise for the organization of real relationships among themselves. If the foreign forces that contribute to overthrowing the regime cannot, if there are any elections without the existence of state organizations, otherwise it will not be chaotic thing. If the foreign forces that contribute to the overthrowing the regime cannot build a new army that supports the state institutions and absorbs armed factions by force or by persuasion, these armed factions don't disappear but mature and become larger to become militias, and many individuals join who did not originally take up arms again during the revolution but sign up because they need protection in the absence of a state, or as a source of livelihood because the militias become employers. The armed revolutionary factions cannot be disarmed in the absence of state institutions, and state institutions cannot be built in the presence of armed factions. This vicious circle has to be broken to find a solution. Sometimes it cannot be broken. Experience has shown that armed movements cannot produce any real achievements in confronting a ruling regime, such as a foreign occupation-run authoritarian state, without a unified leadership and a committed strategy. It also demonstrates that the multiplicity of armed factions resulting from their spontaneous beginnings, their different social environments, or their ideological struggle, or all these factors combined, don't take long to transform power struggle between them into the main conflict. The movement's main energy becomes channeled into conflicts among themselves rather than the underlying conflict they were created for. These movements often fail to unite on their own due to the lack of mutual trust and the prevalence of mutual fear and narcissism, and the illusion of strength produced by carrying arms without military training or party-imposed discipline. Therefore, the movement is either forcibly subjected to the will of one organization, or the same happens by external interventions, or engaged in a prolonged conflict that may lead to the regimes defeating them. This is during the armed conflict phase. In the state-building phase, armed factions have to be integrated into one army or dissolved entirely in order to establish and develop state institutions, either by persuasion or force, preferably by peaceful means. But this requires compromises and settlements that take into account their expectations, ambitions, that in exchange of their sacrifices, their leaders will receive a status or a share in power. This is often better achieved in the case of democratic state. But in an authoritarian state, it does not take long for the repressed conflict between them, which is settled by sharing wealth and or power, transformed into internal purges into the government, and transition to democratic system cannot take place without giving up on armed action, which by definition cannot exist with the state institution and the state monopoly or legitimate violence, and contradicts the absence of equality between those who have weapons and not. does not allow the emergence of a democratic pluralistic system. The most that can be hoped reached between those who bear arms and is a truce or a temporary agreement. Democracy requires abandoning arms altogether, regardless of the extent of the sacrifices made by those who took up arms against dictatorship. Their insistence on bearing arms for political action is in itself a form of tyranny and may turn into the chaos that the public fears more than it fears dictatorship. Therefore, the despotic authoritarian regime may offer an answer to chaos, but in our era, it is a temporary answer. We are still in a historically traditional phase in the Arab world in which everything in a state of inconsistency and fluctuation. In worst cases, only one generation may be persuaded. For reasons that are too long to be explained, and in worst case, one generation may be persuaded that authoritarianism is a cure for chaos. One generation that lived through the revolution and the counter-revolution. But even among this generation, it seems absurd to those who have been subjected to physical and psychological humiliation that their suffering is a sacrifice to them to maintain stability, even if the arguments are laid out in an academic journal read by a few hundred people. And by this I come to the end of what I have prepared for you. Thank you very much for attentive listening. Thank you very much, Dr. Azmi Bishara, for this wonderful paper and this deep analysis of the topic of this forum and the other topics related directly to this topic, such as the democratic transformation and the army and politics, justice, sectarianism, and all these are topics that directly related to our topic, and we will be discussing it. And now the center has also made many strategies. This is only the reverse triangle. We began with the general ideas of the forum. Then we go into the details, and then we summarize some of the research and previous research and papers about the topic. After which, Mr. Frank Burr will be taking the floor, who is from the FARC, and so he has a lot of experience in the field. He will speak as a man from the field, not an academician. In fact, this paper is based on research that I have done, and I also used some of the other aspects referred to by other colleagues. The importance of the colleague is we can look into more details into the reasons behind this forum. We find there is a complete lack or absence in Arab literature of analyzing this issue, the how one transformation from armed to unarmed political action. In fact, there are so many cases of war in our neighboring countries, or 10 out of 20 countries in the Arab world are having such turbulence and such violence, and it is the highest number. The victims are the highest in number all over the world. And despite all that, we don't see any forums to discuss this issue of transformation from armed to unarmed political activity. If we look into the literature that we have in English, we find that the comparative studies are very much limited. And we find that usually the studies are only focusing on one region or one organization, while as what we want in this forum is limited in the. We also that the cooperation is very limited between different major scientific majors and specializations, and analysis through different academic specializations. And you will also find that there's very lack of cooperation between the researchers and the practitioners who are the leaders of transformation. We find that it's rare to have such cooperation. And also, Dr. Azmi also referred to this, that the usual classical security papers and studies need to be reviewed in their terminologies and their summaries, and this is what we are trying to do in the Doha Center in our new major that we are going to be program that will be have critical studies. And if we look into the different databases, such as if we take the MEPET database, which is one of the biggest databases exists until 2008, it includes about 348 armed organizations. And if we look into this database and divide it according to the topics of this forum, find that 41% of this database are about finished organizations that have been dissolved or that ended. And these will be studied in another paper about how did they resist and how they could continue. But what's important are the groups that have come to an end. We can find that these are 268 armed groups came to an end. They finished. We find that the following way. The biggest group, 43% of them ended up to become peaceful constitutional institutions, and most of which are big groups of more than 1,000 members. And there's another group that also ended up with failure, either by losing their legitimacy or their popularity, or by police work or military work, and they collapse as a result of that. Most of these groups are smaller groups of no more than 200 members. Or there are other bigger groups that are achieved victory, military speaking, and remained in power, and this represents only 10%. But if we look into the names of these organizations or groups, and the transformations they witnessed, especially after 2008 and before 1968 when Al-Qaeda began, we found this database needs to be updated and reformulated and rewriting some of its expressions. The expression used the fact that armed group is what's now the expression now used is a terrorist group, and as Doctor said, this needs to be revised and restudied, because most of us did not refer to this. We say that for the Palestinian case, we call them as a resistance group against military occupation or armed, but we never say that as a terrorist.
Even the United Nations, nor politicians or academicians have agreed on a unified definition. For terrorists, the part which is in agreement is targeting civilians for political purposes. And if we apply this, some of the organizations would have to be left out, and some states should be included by that definition. This database, by and large, requires updating and better classification. If we start delving deeply into the dimensions of these changes and transformations, first there is the behavioral aspect, giving up armed field work, field struggle. Ideologically, also there is a tendency to strip any legitimacy and delegitimize political violence and away from the zero-sum game and revisiting history, re-explaining or interpreting history. It's no longer good versus bad. There is more complicated perception. There is more of a gray area. Also, there is a different now assessment or evaluation of the armed struggle, whether it's a negative impact is more than any positive impact, and also less glorification of religious violence, and especially the groups which have a religious terms of reference, they are revisiting their own ideology according to their religious beliefs and religious ideology or theology. There is another dimension, which is the organizational aspect and also disarming the fighters and reintegrating these former fighters into society, or DDR, as our colleagues in conflict resolution said. This is a picture from Algeria, General Ismail al-Mahdi with the Madani Mizraq, the leader of the Salvation Army. We can classify the social changes as follows. First, it will be a comprehensive change or transformation, ideologically plus behaviorally plus organizationally, and also it is pragmatic, which is related basically to when there is no change in the discourse, but there is change at the organizational level and the behavioral level. This means that this organization does not present the previous historic period of their armed struggle as necessarily bad. They do not glorify it, they do not condemn it, they just they do not see that stage as in any negative light either. The third classification relates to the objective changes and at the factional level, when factions start going through divisions, some accept the change into peaceful means of continuing their struggle, and others do not. So some factions go through the transformation and they are very sensitive to democratic change. Some do not agree and continue in the violent struggle. There are examples of this in Spain and Egypt. This is Martin McGuinness with Her Majesty the Queen. If we look at this phenomena, this is a global phenomena. It's not linked to certain organizations or any geographical location. If we stretch the time frame from post-World War II, late 40s, early 50s until today, we will see more than 150 armed groups. We will be discussing 26 of them in this seminar. We will be alluding to over 60 states or countries. 20 of them will be discussed. 6 continents, 4 will be discussed. North America, for example, saw the Black Panthers, and they went through transformation. In Canada, FAQ, the Quebec Liberation Front, they also gave up the armed struggle and resorted to political means of furthering their cause. If we study these transformations or changes, we will see them either complete changes for the entire organization or division into splinter groups and factions, or at the level of certain individuals. But by and large, for the purposes of this seminar, we will be taking into account changes at the total level of the organization. We will also find that in the Arab world, for example, they date back to the 40s of the 20th century. This is José Morica from Uruguay. He used to be leader of the rebels, meeting with President Obama. Why these transformations or changes have occurred and how? This is the number one question for the purposes of research for this seminar. And secondly, what are the conditions for a successful start for such a transformation? In the case of the Arab world, we learned from the Arab Spring that conditions which set off in motion these changes are not necessarily the same ones needed for the continuity and sustainability of these changes. So that leads us to another question. What are the conditions needed for perpetuating this change and making it more sustainable? Also, question number 4 relates to delegitimizing political violence and marketing the idea of the message or the mission. Why organizations which spent decades in armed struggle then start to convince its own members and followers and affiliates of the importance of resorting to peacefulness and giving up violence? So far as legitimacy is concerned, there is a lot of focus on that, and also the question of, in inverted commas, the message or how the discourse is marketed. The UN played a role in this that by saying that violence is not legitimate and any work should be of peaceful nature. And of course, this is for policymakers. Anybody who presents a project, they will be asked how success can be measured, and to measure success there has to be measures. This is easier in the case of organizational and factional change. It's more difficult in the case of individuals. There are different programs now targeting individuals directly. For example, Europeans have programs for fighters who joined ISIS but later on returned to their home countries, and this is directed at them to convince them of giving up violence and resorting to peaceful means of struggle. Also, in in Saudi Arabia, there was a program which was at the center of a great deal of debate, but the statistics were very questionable. They gave success rates of 98%, and they didn't give much details, but they said the likelihood of someone entering this program being a violent person has a 90% chance of success to coming out being totally peaceful. We discovered later on that quite a few of people who graduated from this program became leaders in the Al-Qaeda in Yemen, and like prominent leaders, not just any individuals or members. So the question of measuring success is really important. Okay. Now, if we look at the critical variables on the meso and micro levels, the macro level we will talk about later on. First of all, the question of leadership or command structure. Dr. Azmi mentioned that there should be a central leadership, a charismatic leadership which can influence the middle-ranking leaders and the rank and file of any organization. They should be able to inspire, like spiritually inverted commas. This was a debate which has not been settled yet. Some of our colleagues in psychology departments wanted to put a profile for leaders or people with leadership qualities, and so far as I know, that attempt was not very successful. The second variable was what we call the pressures of the path of armed struggle, which questions the outcome of this confrontation. Will it end up in defeat, in victory, or in a draw? Transformation into peaceful change, in the opinion of some, was the only factor. I saw the situation differently. I think it is one of four factors. For example, ISIS in Iraq were defeated in 2011, but they did not resort to peacefulness. They re-emerged in 2014. Taliban was defeated in Afghanistan, but they did not change into a political struggle, and they were in fact defeated once or twice or thrice in the field, but in conservative estimations, they control 1/3 of the country, and they have influence in about 40 or so percent, as it's reported. So some organizations can be defeated, but do not necessarily accept giving up the armed struggle. And in the case of sometimes there is Sandinistas, for example, won militarily and lost politically on 3 occasions until 2006 when they came back. Although Roberto will give us more details and the divisions inside. But the conclusion here is they can be victorious in battle and also change politically, but these are rare in any event. William Zottin in 1980s talked about the struggle ending up in a draw, no decisive winner. Both sides feel the pain. This applies to Algeria and other countries. Both sides in that armed conflict were feeling the pain of the struggle, and then there was the political process, but in the case of Algeria, there was no political party anyway. The other aspect is the interaction and debate and discussion. This can be at the internal level, but mainly external. This means that the leadership of the organization engages in interaction with those who do not share its worldview. What happens, they update their own worldview and transfer some knowledge to the leadership, and the leadership in turn spreads that into the middle-ranking leadership and the rank and file, and this happened almost in every case where organizations moved from armed struggle to political struggle. Fourthly, the selective inducements, which is a package which can range from improving prison conditions to power sharing or coming out in the guise of a political party, or maybe all these stages. For example, the National Congress in Africa, the beginning was feeling when Mandela felt the pain in his teeth and he started going to the dentist, and then the conversation started. In the Islamic Jama'ah Islamiyah in Egypt, it started when the leaders were in prison and they started revising their ideology. These kind of changes necessarily do not always end up in success. As for the patterns of interaction with changes, there is one aspect, and that is interaction with the other, and also through the charismatic leadership, and maybe the leadership starts thinking differently at the strategic level in terms of gains and losses. Then there'll be change at the ideological level, like updating the worldview when they feel that their worldview is no longer enough to explain what happens around them. Then the leadership decides to embark on the course of peacefulness, and this can lead to some sort of a conflict between the higher ranking hierarchy of the organization and the lower ranks. Finally, sustainability. This requires changes at the total macro level, all levels, and what Dr. Azmi mentioned of political terms, like reforming the security side, the military side, and also transitional justice, and support by the regional support. When we see in the cases of ETA and the IRA, we saw a lot of solidarity from Western European countries and the United States, even at the times when there was violent acts committed in the middle of the political process. There was a push towards an outcome for the political process. In the case of Arab countries, there's no such support from the regional powers or states. The Arab Spring and its impact, we know these changes started taking place before 2011. They started in Egypt and Libya, and we will find that in the period between 2011 and 2013, some of these groups, the groups which went through the transformation, either took part in the political process or took part in drafting the constitution, like in the Jama'ah Islamiyya case or some Libyan groups. Some also engaged in a process of compromise. Also, there was the case of some joining military or security organizations or engaging in counter-terrorism and countering ISIS. But sustainability was a real problem. The points mentioned in this slide, like the freedom of information, transitional justice, reforming the security sector, the relations between the military-civilian aspect of the country, education, the media. We see that sometimes the struggle continues, but not with bullets at the level of political struggle between parties or at the level of the media. There was no focus on that, but reform attempts at the military or the security or the educational level more or less have all been put an end to. Also, the question of how important is to keep your arms. If in a country where there is no guarantees, no constitution, no political process or anything, this led some members of these organizations to start thinking that the best guarantee will be to keep their arms for their own survival, if nothing else. Also, delegitimization, when some people mention that some individuals in these organizations, the rank and file, start posing questions that now we gave up our arms and we engage in a political struggle. What next? What is to become of us? So this kind of questions has repercussions, and questions have been raised about the future of such change and transformation. Organizations like ISIS and that benefit from such interaction, and they start recruiting members of other organizations, maybe. Finally, there is a question of you can start a process, embark on a process, but you cannot continue. And I want here to bring into play what happened in Latin America. Europe is a different story. Europe is a continent where democracy has been established and is deeply rooted, and there is the kind of societal and organizational support. That's a different level. Latin America is probably closer to us, and most of these transformations have been sustainable despite the lack of resources. Some countries do not have the resources the Arab world has. Despite that, the transformation has survived, continued, despite the scarcity of resources. So Frank maybe can tell us about any comparison and what he did. I'll leave it here because I took more than the time allocated to me, These were some academic terminology some of you may find boring, but Frank has field work in this. First of all, I would like to welcome the former minister and the former negotiator between FARC and LAN, Frank Bell. He will give us his personal observations about this process of change. Thank you for your kind attention. I forgot to this slide. These are cases which will be discussed in this seminar. We leave the questions till after Frank's presentation. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation. It's an honor and a privilege for me to be here today to share with you the view that we have on what has happened and what we have done in Colombia in the last years. In our country, as in many Latin American countries, we have had armed groups fighting against the state for several reasons. I think it's important to acknowledge that we are countries in which there's a lot of disparity and inequality. We have advanced a lot, but we still face many challenges. In the case of Colombia in particular, excuse me, we have had armed groups for decades. Their origin relates to a closed political system in the last century, a political system that still faces challenges in terms of being real open to different perspectives, and of course to the geopolitical dynamics related to the Cold War and the role of the former Soviet Union in Latin American countries. Every country from Mexico to Argentina in Latin America has had armed groups that had fought against the state that in some point in time closed deals or ended up that form or looking for their objectives. Every Colombian president in the last 50 years tried to achieve a peace deal with the guerrillas. The process that we went through from 2009 until 2016 is a process that is a consequence of previous attempts to cut a deal with FARC especially, but also based on experiences, on processes that in which we were able to achieve deals with different smaller guerrilla groups in our country. At the end of the decade of the 80s, there was an important peace process with M19. We had a new constitution in 1991. There was political opening. There was the intent to modernize our institutions, but still FARC remained acting as a guerrilla, and unfortunately, the impact of narco traffic strengthened their finances and allowed them to maintain their struggle for many years. I think it might be too early to reflect on what we have done, but I'll try to think out loud and identify some issues which are critical and necessary for achieving a deal with a group that is fighting against the state. I remember in 2010, when we were preparing the strategy for the negotiation, and one of our advisors told us, why don't you sit down and write the speech that the guerrilla leader will read to his people and to the country if you achieved a deal. And we asked him, why do we need to do that? And he said, because you need to understand where he comes from, what he needs, and what he needs to convey to his group in order to be able to maintain the group together, aligned, to move to the next phase. So we sat down. I still have that paper on my computer and wrote down the speech that at that time Alfonso Cano would read to the country announcing a final deal with the government. That allowed us, that exercise allowed us to understand where they come from. And when we were years later sitting at the table, one exercise that we did every single day was assessing or trying to assess FARC's willingness to cut a deal and their ability or ableness to do so. If you have a counterpart that is willing and able to work towards a deal in conditions that might be accepted for both parties and beneficial for the country, then you need to persist. If there's not willingness or if they're not able, then you have to wait. Because probably the political system or the mentality or where society stands at that point in time will not allow the efforts to become fruitful. What we did is we did a lot of planning. This process, the latest process with FARC started in 2009. I myself have spent 7 years working in that process, and it's a collective effort. What we are still working on and what we have achieved is part of an effort that was made by a very strong group with different perspectives, fully committed to sign a peace agreement that was acceptable for the counterpart and good for the country. We thought the process needed to be conducted in 3 phases: the secret conversations, the secret contacts, in which you would define rules of engagement to set up an agenda. Then in the second phase, you would secretly negotiate the agenda. In the case of Colombia, we did that in 2012, from February until August. We did that in Cuba. And we agreed an agenda of 6 points: rural reform, political reform, drug issues, end of the conflict, which has to do with arms, justice system, and implementation. And we agreed on rules of engagement. There's a lot of advisors that might tell you, you need to gain the trust of your counterpart, and you need to come to trust your counterpart. I personally disagree with that. I think when there's a lot of history, when there's so many crimes and atrocities and abuses that have been committed on both sides, it is impossible. Oftentimes, it is absolutely impossible to trust the person that you have in front of you. But that lack of trust cannot prevent you from working to what I consider a moral duty, which is we need to stop killing one another. We're human beings. We need to make it possible in every country and in every society to allow ourselves to have tolerance, to have compassion, to understand where the other one comes from. And that doesn't mean justifying their actions. I'm not justifying violence. I can understand where FARC came from. I can understand what they did, but I will never justify their actions, as I will never justify violent actions coming from any state. So, instead of trying to trust the counterpart, which is very difficult, what we did is to build a process in which both parties could trust. And that is totally different. So that's what we agreed on, certain rules of engagement. That's what we brought certain countries as guarantors. And we would have mechanisms, checks and balances to counteract the lack of trust that probably was there at the end, and it's still there. So one of the keys is to be able to set up a system within the process and set up rules of engagement after you sign the deal, so both parties begin trusting not one another, but trusting a new system. Because this is about creating a new system in societies that need change. In our case, we have a country in which a lot or most of the land is owned by very few people, in which there's lack of opportunities for peasants and people that work the land, in which there's 50% informality in the non-urban areas, in which we had 14 million people living in the middle of the conflict, trapped by the inefficiency or absence of the institutions within a political and economic system that had prevented them to tapping opportunities and achieving their potential. So this is about bringing change. That's why we included political reform. And there's no one topic, there's no one issue here in which you would be able to find consensus within a country. There's people in Colombia that are against this deal. This peace process divided our country. We lost the plebiscite. More than 50% of Colombians who voted that day decided that they didn't want the deal. When you're embedded in a process, when you're committed to a process, probably it's tough to understand, but we need also to understand that those people that voted for the no had concerns, and they still have concerns, and those are legitimate concerns. So probably the fact that we lost the plebiscite was more due to our lack as a team to convey the appropriate messages, to have a coherent and comprehensive communications strategy, to conduct the process in a different manner to be able to convey the benefits that it would bring to the country. But we need a political opening. We're a country which has been governed or had been governed until recently mainly by two parties. And there is still very difficult, it's still very difficult in Colombia to start a new political movement, to start a new political party. And there's people that have not felt represented by the institutions and the current politicians. So we need not to force them to resort to violence. We need to open up the political spectrum, the civic participation spectrum, and be open to new and different ideas and debates to be able to change and modernize our system. The narco-traffic issue, it was very difficult to include it in the agenda. But narco-traffic had been the fuel of these groups for the last decades. And it has to do also with international relations. So we needed a commitment from FARC to end those activities. and to be able to share the information that they have in relation to other organizations that were deploying those activities. Not to end narco-traffic, which is very difficult, but to put an end from that side to the problem. Then you have the justice issue, which brings a lot of debate. What is justice? When you're in these negotiations, you're forced to think, who am I? What is it that I really think? What is it that I really believe in? What are those ideas that I'm willing to defend and move forward no matter what? And the justice issue, it's probably the most difficult one, especially in a country which has been harmed by so many violent acts and atrocities. We had thousands of people being killed, kidnapped. It's important for societies at one point in time to acknowledge that we're fearful. Colombia is a country in which there was and still is a lot of fear, a lot of rage. But oftentimes we don't recognize and we don't acknowledge that we have fear and that fear leads to rage. And the issue of justice is contaminated by those feelings. If you have, as I saw once, in a non-urban area of the country, a woman with 3 little girls living in a house without water, without electricity, no options for education. Kids in those areas were surrounded by coca crops, and the only option that they might have is to be taken by an illegal group and be forced to be part of the conflict. I have that image in my mind. So oftentimes when we were discussing the justice system for FARC, I was asking myself, who am I working for? Because I need to recognize that several times I felt rage against FARC members that were on the other side of the table, as they felt the same towards me because of what they'd done. And probably one part of me was saying, if this guy killed someone, if this guy kidnapped somebody, he deserves to be 40 years in jail. Well, that's justice looking backwards. It is legitimate. If you look at the act by itself, it might be all right. But in a context in which you want to end the conflict and end violence and provide 14 million people that were in the same situation as those 3 little girls and that woman, then you ask yourself, what is it right to do? Justice for whom? Justice for what? Justice towards the past or justice towards the future? And we chose a system in which victims will be at the center of the agreement, in which their rights would prevail, in which perpetrators would need to comply to the tribunals and tell the complete truth, give up their assets, repair victims symbolically and materially, and move forward, even with the option of having political participation. And that generated a lot of debate in our country, because oftentimes societies get confused, and we human beings get confused. Oftentimes we confuse our need or wanting for peace with us wanting justice. And oftentimes we confuse us wanting justice with us wanting revenge. So we need to ask ourselves, is our country or our society prepared for a process like this one? If the country is not ready, the leaders of the country need to prepare different interest groups and recognize and acknowledge fear and rage and be able to develop a narrative so that the different interest groups can move forward. And then you have the practical items that lead to the real challenge, which is how do you make this sustainable? You can sign a deal with or without political support. In every case, in every country, those groups or leaders that have signed peace deals have seen as traitors, but a faction or a group of their societies. And that is because fears and legitimate concerns have not been properly addressed. It's impossible to address everybody's concerns. But I would say that in general terms, in every country, you have 6 challenges to make it possible for peace deals to be sustainable. And you need to be able to assess the readiness of a society and the readiness of its institutions to make these changes. The first has to do with legal issues. Is it a requisite for the implementation of the agreements to have legal reforms, to have political reforms? Is the political system ready to do so? Are the institutions in power willing and able to do so? In our case, we need to convey several reforms related to the political system, political participation, to the way land is being used and distributed. That one is pending, and some political ones are pending as well. The past government was not able to enact all the reforms that we need, and this government is not in the way of doing that. So we have a gap that needs to be filled for this to be sustainable from the legal and political reforms issue. The second one, institutions. Do the institutions have the collective capacity and the collective ability to implement changes and reform, to include those that were part of the conflict one way or another, so they become part of the political, social, cultural system of the country? The third, economic. Where are those areas in one country in which resources need to be invested, and for what purpose, and where is the money coming from? As you were saying, in Latin America, we have more challenges in that front than the ones you have here, but still you need to be able to identify those regions and those population groups that need to be benefited in a way to make the deal sustainable. The other, political agreements. And political agreements need to be conducted at the national, regional, and very importantly, at the local level. So when you're implementing a peace agreement, you need to have your network identified with the different interest and political groups, and being able to tap alliances that are sustainable in every region of the country, aligned with the economic incentives that you will provide, bringing together the private sector and the state. So you have political alliances, institutional strengthening, resources coming in, and the private sector providing a long-term view that governments do not provide in difficult times. Then social agreements. In every region of the country, you have different interest groups. A few of them might be against the project. Some of them might be pro the implementation of the peace agreements. Others might be indifferent. So it's important to understand what set of incentives will be provided for each interest groups, so you can provide civic alliances, not political, but civic alliances, in terms of committing citizens, groups of citizens that will actively participate in the in the implementation of the process. And then the sixth element has to do with diplomacy. how are you going to identify your alliances? Without, I think, one exception, every single armed conflict that has been solved needs the support of neighboring countries and the support of the region. And that was the case of Colombia. We had the support of Cuba, and we had the support of Venezuela, Brazil, and Chile. We have a lot of differences in terms of their view of the society with the Cuban government and with the Venezuelan government. And we have some difference with Brazil, and we have differences with Chile. But to build an alliance is to be able to identify one project in which your ally will benefit as well. That doesn't mean that you're identifying yourself or your country or your system with another one. You maintain your differences, you respect your differences, you value your differences, but within those differences, we build one project in which everybody will benefit from. And then the next or the final phase, which has to do with when things are being decantted in the regions, in people's hearts, in the political struggle, is how do you really make changes in a society? If you're going to embark your country, your society, your group in a peace deal, there needs to be a firm commitment from the leadership of a country. Not only the person that is leading the country politically at one point in time, but you need a critical mass of political leaders, civic leaders, journalists, people from the private sector, students, that are committed to changing the conditions. Because if conditions are not changed, we will resort to violence again. So in the case of Colombia, we have advanced. We have signed a deal. It's not the first one that we signed. We have signed many deals with guerrilla groups. But the challenge that we have is to make real what we wrote. It is a different challenge. It's a difficult challenge in a country in which there's a lot of indifference, because in the urban areas, people have not felt in the last years the impact of the conflict. So the challenge that we have is really a change in mentality. It's really a change that has to do not with judging others, but with understanding where others come from, to be really willing and able to include them as equals in a system that we share and in a system that we need to improve. Just to close, when I was thinking of the possibility of working in a peace process, and this was in 2006 or in 2007, I thought that conducting a peace process or being part of a peace process was something that entailed a technical challenge and a political challenge, because you needed to study a lot of issues, a lot of topics. You need to be able to know your system in order to be able to contribute with the group to define what are the solutions that are best for people. And then a political challenge in terms of being able to obtain the political support. But in all those years in which I was sitting across the table and talking to people that have had such a different life from mine, I understood, and I think they understood as well, that this goes beyond a technical and a political challenge. It's a personal challenge. If you will, it's a spiritual challenge. You need to confront yourselves with your values, with your convictions, with your willingness to be generous and compassionate towards people that have harmed you in many ways, and do that not thinking of your own interest, but thinking of the interest of people that don't even know you or whom you're not related to. And I think in today's world, here in this part of the world, and everywhere where we have armed conflict, we need to go back to basics. It is not that complex. We're human beings. It makes no sense that we kill one another. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency Frank Pell. Now we have a short break for tea or coffee. Then we will start the sessions. The next session will be an academic session whereby Dr. Khalil Ainani, Dr. Haider Saeed, and Mr. Hamza Al-Mustafa will be speaking. I just wanted quickly to speak about the expected outcomes of this seminar. There will be a report with all the recommendations which will be published by the Arab Center. Some of the papers will be published in our journal, Siyasat Arabiya, Arab Policies. Also, there will be a volume published which will include the papers presented and the translation to English of them. Also, we want to also launch a new program of research and open it to researchers in this part of the world. Thank you.